Morning. I would ask if you have a Bible, you would be opening it up to the 15th chapter of the book of Judges. Judges chapter 15 is where we'll spend the majority of our time here this morning as we examine one of the, in my opinion, one of the more interesting characters that you see in Scripture, the story of Samson. Samson is one of those people that we know kind of a lot about, but we tend to compartmentalize him in kind of very specific ways. He's this big guy, he's really strong, and then he died in the huge collapse, and that's really all we know about him. And so we just kind of look at him in very one-dimensional terms. And I would argue, too, that another person we do that with is somebody like Solomon. We discussed Solomon at length last year, or last quarter. I guess it was last year, too. But last quarter we talked about Solomon, and we talked about how he was this uber-rich, this very wealthy, this very wise individual who seemed to just kind of go downhill. It seems like he kind of peaked in 1 Kings chapter 3, and then he just kind of steadily went downhill. Until he ends in 1 Kings chapter 11, the end of that chapter with him just kind of chasing Jeroboam into Egypt and then him dying. It seems like a very, whatever that word is, I can never say that, very bad end for somebody who seemed to have so much. And so we asked the question at the beginning of that quarter, we asked the question at the end of that quarter, was Solomon saved? And as soon as I said that, I remember the look that Joyce gave me, which was, you're not in a position to ask that, Brady. And that's exactly right. I am not in a position to weigh in on Solomon's eternal destiny. That's not my job. I'm a very finite, mortal human being. I don't have eternal judgment capabilities. But the question about what Solomon saved was not so much to ask whether or not he's in heaven, but to ask what our interpretation of him is. Because there were some people that said, well, Solomon was absolutely saved because Ecclesiastes, which a lot of people think was written at the end of his life, seems to be more of like a repentant type of treatise. That at the end of his life, he kind of comes to terms with what the meaning of life is, and obedience, and the fear of God, all those types of things. And so it would seem as if at the end of Solomon's life, that he was right where he needed to be, that he understands that the only thing that matters is to fear God and keep His commandments. And there are other people on the other end of the equation that look at it and say, well, when you look at 1 Kings chapter 11, and it says that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and it says very definitively that they turned his heart away from God, that pretty much defines it. Not that that seals his fate necessarily, but for lack of better effort, or lack of better understanding, or more material, that's all we can really deduce from him. And so people had one of two differing opinions, and it got really heated there for a second. We were able to damp it down a little bit. But the question ultimately was about whether or not Solomon was saved, because that depends on how we view on him. That was really what the whole question was about, was how we view him. And I would argue, too, that we can do the exact same thing with Samson. When you look at Samson, we tend to look at him in one of two ways. He's either a chosen vessel of God, somebody who is doing monumental and momentous types of things for Israel, freeing them from the bounds of their captivity, or we view him as this big dumb brute that basically killed 1,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey, grabbed a couple of gates and took them to the top of a mountain, which, by the way, is the most undervalued aspect of the Samson story, that he just grabs 2 gates and takes them to the top of the mountain. And then he just kind of dies in this big collision where he pulls the pillars down. And we look at him in the same way we look at Solomon. There's nothing really to him. He dies, he's buried, and that's that. And I don't necessarily think that that's the way we can look at him. If it were like Solomon, where the very last thing we hear about Solomon is that he just dies and he's buried, if it was like that with Samson, that'd be one thing. But when you look at Hebrews chapter 11, which is the hall of faith, and so many people look at Hebrews 11, and I think rightfully so, as being an example for us of models to look toward, people that displayed extraordinary faith in pretty intense circumstances. At the end of this chapter, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, it almost seems like the Hebrew writer is just kind of wrapping stuff up. Because he says here, verse 32 down through verse 40, he says, what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, of Barak, of Samson, of Jephthah, of David, of Samuel, of the prophets. And he just kind of bullet points these people. But then he says in verse 33, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, for weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. And so in verses 32 through 34, he lists these people. By the way, Jephthah isn't exactly a shining character either. But he lists these people in this section that just seem to be kind of thrown in there. And Samson kind of speaks out. He just kind of jumps out at you. Because up until that point in the narrative of the entire Bible, Samson doesn't seem to be that forward of an individual. But then when you look down there in verse 35 down through verse 40, it says women received back their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, not accepting their release, so they might obtain a better resurrection. Others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonments. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy. wandering around in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. And listen to this in verse 39. All of these, having gained approval through their faith, that includes Samson, did not receive what was promised because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us they would not be made perfect. Hebrews chapter 11 just lumps Samson in this group of people in the Hall of Faith and says that by his faith he was made perfect. That's kind of the insinuation from that passage. And so the question is, maybe was Samson better than we thought? Because we look at him in the narrative in Judges chapter 14 through 16. He kills thousands of people. He marries a Philistine. The very first act that's said about his life is he goes into an enemy country and marries a Philistine woman. He seems especially prone to rage. I think that's a very kind of subtle, kind of very understated statement about Samson. And then to top it all off, at the end of his life, he reveals the secret to his strength, which nobody really understands. Delilah's already fooled him twice before. Why now does he think it'll be any different? We'll explore that this morning as well. And so it doesn't appear on the surface, at least, that Samson really is somebody who is worthy of Hebrews chapter 11, of inclusion in the Hall of Faith. Now I will tell you, there is some people who would argue that Samson, rather than being evil, was doing exactly what he was designed to do. If you look at Judges chapter 2, look at Judges chapter 2. You're still in Judges. Jump back 13 chapters of Judges chapter 2. In Judges chapter 2, at the end of this chapter that describes the captivity and the situation these people are in, in Judges chapter 2, he starts talking, or the writer starts talking about the purpose of judges. In verse 16 it says, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them, yet they did not listen to their judges. For they played the harlot after other gods and bowed themselves down to them. They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked and obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They didn't do as their fathers. That's talking about Israel. Now, verse 18, the Lord raised up judges for them, and the Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed and afflicted them. But it came about, verse 19, as the cycle of the Jews so oftentimes did, it came about that when the judge died, that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers did, and following other gods to serve them, to bow down to them. And they did not abandon their practices on their stubborn ways. So, verse 20, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. And he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in it as their fathers did, or not. Verse 23, so the Lord allowed these nations to remain, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. The whole purpose of the judges, if you look at Judges chapter 2, was not to just be these superheroes that just kind of came out. And obviously the Avengers on my mind right now because of the month that we're about to enter. But the judges were not designed to be that way. They were not designed to be these people that just came in and were models of integrity. Some of them were great individuals. But their whole purpose in Judges chapter 2 was to free them from the captivity. And Samson falls right in line with that. If anybody, Samson falls right in line with that. You can look at some of the other judges. You can look at some of them that had magnificent type of stories. Barak and Deborah come to mind. And that was their whole purpose. But Samson typifies that. Almost single-handedly destroying thousands of Philistines and the rulers that were over the Israelites. And so when you fast forward to Judges chapter 14 and you look in verse 4, this is where a lot of people will say, well, maybe this was all part of God's design. Because in Judges chapter 14 and verse 4, there's an interesting kind of section, and I speak Greek and Hebrew except on the weekends. For some reason, it just vanishes from my brain. But when you look at, that was sarcasm, by the way. But when you look at Judges chapter 14 and verse 4, there's an interesting kind of phrase that's thrown in there. Judges chapter 14 and verse 4, after Samson has argued that he wants to take a wife from the Philistines, he asks for it or demands for it in verse 3. And then in verse 4 it says, his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Now at that time the Philistines were ruling over Israel. Based on my very, very limited understanding of Hebrew, my understanding is that that word he, that's capitalized by the translators, can, according to some people, mean Samson. And so the argument in that phrase in Judges chapter 14 and verse 4 is that everything that follows from Judges 14:1 all the way through the end of Judges chapter 16 was Samson on a very calculated and a very deliberate path to destroy the Philistines. Now, I'll be up front right now and tell you that I don't necessarily agree with all that. I think there's some implications there that the Scriptures do not advocate for. But it's kind of an interesting thought when you think about it. Regardless of how you look at it, in Judges chapter 14, it's clear that there's more at stake. It's clear that what's happening in Judges chapter 14 through 16 is not just Samson going off the deep end and doing whatever it is that he wants to. Maybe, but it was ultimately for a purpose. And so the question that we asked at the beginning of this is whether or not Samson is saved. Ultimately, that question jumps back to some of this. If you look at Hebrews chapter 11 as I catch up on my notes, when you look at Judges chapter 14 verse 4, the question is, was he doing something he's supposed to do? Was he doing what he was designed to do? Was he fulfilling a very specific goal? And I would argue to you that he was. But I'll also tell you that there are some verses, I think, that you look at the Bible that speak to Samson on a much deeper level. As we mentioned earlier, look at Samson in very one-dimensional terms. He was big, he was strong, his favorite weapon was a jawbone of a donkey, and that's that. But there are some verses in the Scriptures that speak about Samson, not directly, but that talk about who he is. And the very obvious one in my mind is Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 13. Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 13, as Solomon is writing about the nature of marriage and about the relationship that two people have. It talks about it being great on a whole lot of occasions. Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 13 are not really that great. Because as Solomon mentions here in Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 13, a foolish son is destruction to his father, and the contentions of a wife are a constant dripping. Both of those phrases, ladies and gentlemen, apply to Samson. Now Solomon would talk, I think, on 3 or 4 different occasions about how a wife, or the contentions of a wife are a constant dripping, or like, it's better to live in a corner roof, that type of stuff. By the way, before you accuse me of being misogynistic, that can apply with a husband as well. It goes both ways. Some husbands think that they're just kind of in the free there. But the constant contention of a wife or a constant dripping, that sums up Samson. Obviously, he was foolish on a number of occasions. That first half applies to him. But Samson did not have the best criteria in selecting a wife. Let's just put it that way. When you look at Judges chapter 14, literally the very first thing out of the gate, the very first thing that happens to him, is he goes into another nation and takes a wife from the enemy nations. And Judges chapter 13, kind of leading up to this kind of shows you the background. In Judges chapter 13 and verse 24, the background of 13 is God talking to Samson's parents. But in verse 24, the woman gave birth to a son and named him Samson. The child grew up and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mahanadan between Zorah and Eshtaol. Then Samson, chapter 14 and verse 1, went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines, and he came back, verse 2. This is the very first thing that he does. Comes back and tells his father and mother, I saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore, get her for me as a wife. Imagine saying that to your parents. I don't think I would have been able to sit down for at least an hour, maybe 2 if my mom joined in on the fun. Verse 3, that his father and mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives, or among all of your people, that you go take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And then Samson replies back even more bluntly, and says to his father, get her for me, for she looks good. The only criteria that Samson has in this passage in Judges chapter 14 is she is beautiful. The only thing Samson cares about is that she's physically attractive. I want her now. He tells his parents that. His parents say, well, let's think about this a little bit. Why don't you go to your Israelites? Why don't you go to your own people? Let's use a little bit more in the criteria than just physical beauty. Samson obliterates all of that. Doesn't care. Says, get her for me now. That's the criteria that Samson has. And as you go down in this chapter, look at verse 15. After the marriage takes place, in Judges chapter 14, Samson has a riddle. And this is one of the more famous sections of Samson's life. Judges chapter 14 and verse 14. It says, he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. But they couldn't tell the riddle in 3 days. By the way, I wouldn't have been able to answer that either, in case you were wondering. Verse 15, it came about on the 4th day that they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband, so that he will tell us the riddle, or we will burn you and your father's house with fire. That's escalated quickly. Have you invited us to impoverish us? Is this not so? And Samson's wife, verse 16, wept before him and said, you only hate me and you do not love me. You have propounded a riddle to the sons of my people and have not told it to me. But listen to what Samson has the gall to say back to her. I have not even told it to my father and mother, so why should I tell you? That's a horrible start to marital bliss. Don't ever say that to your wife, newlyweds. Verse 17, however, she wept before him 7 days while their feast lasted, and on the 7th day he told her because she pressed him so hard. That's the key phrase. She then told the riddle to the sons of her people. The men of the city said to him on the 7th seventh day before the sun went down. What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And he says back then, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. That's another good marital lesson. Don't ever call your wife a cow. All throughout this in Judges chapter 14, Samson is not only displaying literally the worst judgment in regards to selecting a wife, but then the wife that he's chosen for himself chooses the money, chooses the family, chooses the loyalty to the country over her new husband. This honeymoon period is like 5 seconds long. And so Samson is already, at the very beginning of his marriage, chosen poorly in regards to his future wife. And if it ended there, that'd be one thing, but it doesn't. As you progress throughout the story, he eventually visits a prostitute at some point, which then that's where the gate story, where he picks up the gates and takes them to the mountain. But then Delilah enters the picture. I want you to go to Judges chapter 16, starting in verse 4. Just a couple of pages. In Judges chapter 16 and verse 4, it says, after this it came about that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Samson is obviously a very emotional person, as you can see so far. But the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and see where his great strength lies and how we may overpower him, that he may bind, or that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we'll each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. And that phrase, by the way, will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver, that's a ton of cash. I've seen people that have kind of commandeered this and said, well, this is similar to Judas. It is. The act itself is similar to Judas. But we're talking about a whole lot more money in regards to Delilah getting than what Judas got. Judas was a horrible businessman amongst a whole bunch of really awful things. Delilah in verse 6 says to Samson, please tell me where your great strength is and how you may be bound to afflict you. Delilah doesn't even put up a fight. Delilah at no point in these 3 verses ever says, well, let me think about it, or let me angle for more money at least, or well, he's my husband. None of that takes place. She literally walks up to Samson in the very next verse and says, tell me the secret of your strength. She is willing, ladies and gentlemen, to sell her husband out to the Philistines, which is exactly what his first wife did. And then you jump down to verse 15, after a couple kind of fakes that Samson gives her, verse 13 rather. Delilah says to Samson, up until now you have deceived me, you have told me lies. Tell me now how you may be bound. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my hair with the web and fasten it with the pin, then I will become weak and be like any other man. This is obviously another ruse. So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his hair, wove them into the web, and she fastened it with the pin and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. He awoke from his sleep, pulled the pin out of the loom and the web. Then she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? She's one to talk. You have deceived me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength is. And it came about, listen to this in verse 16, it came about that when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him, that his soul was annoyed to death. You know where we heard that same phrase before? Chapter 14, talking about his first wife. The exact same scenario plays out. Verse 17, so he told her all that was in his heart and said to her, a razor has never come upon my womb, or come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me, I will become weak and be like any other man. And when Delilah saw that he had told her all that was in his heart, she then sends for the Philistines to take him down. The question has been since a billion years, or for not a billion years, but for hundreds of years, why is Samson so willing in this third kind of situation to just willingly give over the secret of his strength? He knew what was going to happen. She's already done it twice before. Why is it that he's willing to do it now? The answer, ladies and gentlemen, is found in that verse when it says that she pressed him and annoyed his soul to death. Think about this real quick. You have the 2, and we'll bring up Solomon here in a second, but you have the 2 greatest people, arguably the most resourceful, the strongest, people that should never have fallen. Samson, the mightiest person arguably in the entire Bible. And then you have Solomon, the wisest and the richest person that has ever walked the face of the earth. Both of these individuals taken down by women. And that's not a commentary on women, by the way. That's in case you think I'm saying I'm something I'm not. It's a horrible phrase, you know what I mean? That's not a commentary on women. But what it is meant to show you is the fact that whereas the world couldn't take them down, or whereas the Philistine army couldn't take him down, 1,000 Philistines couldn't take him down, his wife did. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you hear nothing else from this section, and I don't want any of complaints to me on Wednesday that this conversation erupted in the car on the way home into something I didn't mean for it to be. But if you hear nothing else, hear me on this. It matters, ladies and gentlemen, who you marry. There will be nobody in your life that has a greater impact on your soul, on your life on this earth, than the one that you have joined yourself to for your time on this earth. Your spouse has more influence on you in more ways than we can even know consciously. And you see Samson as being exhibit A of this. Samson was arguably the strongest person that has ever walked the face of the earth, up there with all of them. And he was taken down, ladies and gentlemen, not by a Philistine warrior, but by his wife. It matters, ladies and gentlemen, who you marry in this life, because they have that type of influence over you. I'll tell you this to another verse, because I want to move quickly away from the nagging wife verse. But another verse I think that speaks so well to Samson's life is found in Genesis chapter 50. Most of us are familiar with the story of Genesis 50. Genesis 50 is the culmination of at least 7 or 8 different chapters. In 7 chapters leading up to it, you have Joseph that is on just the worst, there's having just the worst life ever. Joseph is bound by his brothers, thrown into a pit, left for dead, sold to traders. He becomes a slave in Egypt, which basically is a death sentence. And somehow, because of God's providence, because of his interpretation of dreams, he ascends to the highest position in Egypt that you can be born into. And so Joseph eventually finds himself second only to Pharaoh to establish kind of this food budget, this food dispensary for all the people in the entire land, which this is a huge empire. He's got a ton of authority. And his brothers, as the time went by, his brothers show up at his doorstep, as nearly everybody else did in the empire, wanting to have some kind of food. Let me give you some money so we can buy some food. Now Joseph does what I think a lot of people would do in this situation. Plays around with them a little bit, kind of teases them, sends them back their own way. You can make your own arguments up about whether or not that was right. But then at some point, Joseph comes face to face with his brothers. And you would expect in that situation somebody to just throw them to the wolves, or throw them way off the deep end, or punish them, put them in jail, or at the very least, do to them what they did to him. And Genesis chapter 50 is one of the best phrases for this that I can think of. It's the best response that you can have. When he says to them, "As for you, you meant evil against me." They did. But God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. There's no doubt about Joseph's brothers' intentions. They wanted him to die. They wanted him at least to go to a different country. They wanted him to suffer. And when Joseph then turns around the situation on its head and looks at them and says, "Well, you meant it for evil, God meant it for good." Now, there's a whole bunch of extrapolations you can make out of that, but the simple matter remains that God can take anything in this life, if he wants to, and turn it into something good. And that applies to Samson. There's no doubt that Samson was evil at times, that he was impulsive, that he was acting carnally at times, but he enacted the deliverance of Israel, at least on this one occasion. And in case you think this is an isolated instance, you can look at all the minor prophets, especially the book of Habakkuk, where God sends the Babylonians to destroy Israel. And they look out and they say, "Why the Babylonians? They're evil." And God says, "They are an instrument of mine. I'm using them for this time period. They'll be judged, don't worry. But I'm using them for this time period." And that's exactly what Samson was meant to be. Look in Judges chapter 15, starting in verse 5. To understand the nature of Samson's life, I think the secret is found here in verse 5 down to verse 11. Judges chapter 15, starting in verse 5. This is after another humorous incident in Samson's life where he takes 2 foxes, ties their tails together, puts a torch in between them, and sends them off into the field, which is humorous if it weren't so destructive. Good prank. Actually, it's a bad prank, depending on how you look at it. Judges chapter 15 and verse 5. It says, "When he had set fire to the torches, he released the foxes and the standing grain of the Philistines, thus burning up the shocks and the standing grain, along with the vineyards and the groves." This is a pretty intense decimation. It's not like these people that go down to Aldi's or go down to Brookshire's to get more groceries. This is designed to feed an entire land for a long period of time. In verse 6, the Philistines said, "Who did this?" Well, they said, "Well, it was Samson, the son of the law of the Timnite, because he took his wife and gave her to his companion." The Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. That's pretty intense. Verse 7, Samson said to them, "Since you act like this, I will surely take revenge on you, but after that I will quit." And he struck them ruthlessly with a great slaughter and went and lived in the cleft of the rock of Edom. Notice the palpable tension that exists between the Israelites and the Philistines. The Philistines, verse 9, went up and camped in Judah and spread out in Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" And they said, "We have come up to bind Samson in order to do to him as he did us." And 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom, and Samson and said to him, now listen to this, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us?" What then is this that you have done to us? And he said to them, as they have done to me, so I have done to them. By the way, this verse directly contradicts the later passages where Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and they say we've never been in bondage to anybody. By their own mouth, they were in bondage to the Philistines. But what Judges chapter 15, especially there in verse 11, represents is the fact that they acknowledge that the Philistines own them. That nobody's going to make the Philistines mad. Certainly not going to take a bunch of foxes and light them on fire and throw them through a field, because that only angers them. They're mad at Samson. And Samson is basically acting on his own by saying, I'm doing this because of what they've done to me. And that puts the last act of Samson's life in the even more closer picture, because when you look at Judges chapter 16, the very end of this section, Judges chapter 16, as you have this fantastic final scene with Samson, it says it so happened, verse 25 of Judges chapter 16, that when they were in high spirits, this is talking about the Philistines, that they said to him, call for Samson that he may amuse us. You remember that Samson was bound in the prison of the Philistines and had his eyes gouged out. He was meant to be a grinder in the prison. So they called for Samson from the prison. He entertained them, and they made him stand between the pillars. And Samson said to the boy who was holding his hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. Now listen to verse 27, because it gives good biographical information. The house was full of men and women, and all, listen to this, the lords of the Philistines were there. And about 3,000 men and women were on the roof looking, while Samson was amusing them. This is a huge gathering, and we oftentimes talk in terms of grand numbers. 3,000 people there. That is a ton of people in one location. And it shows the magnitude of Samson's destruction, on par with like 9/11 type of destruction. That's the scale that we're talking about here. But what's even more noticeable here in verses 26 and 27 is not just that the Philistines are there, but that the lords of the Philistines are there. Those are the rulers over the Philistines. And so this great final act of Samson, where he pushes down the pillars and a bunch of people die, it's more intense than just a lot of people die. He's literally taking down, with a huge blow, a part of the empire. And so when we flash back to Judges chapter 14 and verse 4, and it says that his parents didn't understand Samson's association with the Philistines because God was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines, you see that in Judges chapter 16. Was Samson evil at times? Yeah. Did he do the wrong thing at times? Yes. Was he carnal? Yes. But did that mean that he couldn't achieve the purpose of God? Absolutely not. Because you have Samson in Judges chapter 16 dealing a vicious blow to the Philistines, one that crippled them and would cripple them for decades after this. Judges chapter 15 verse 20 is a perfect verse that applies to him because everybody meant it for evil. But God was able to use Samson to achieve his own purpose, which speaks not only to the providence of God, the omniscience of God, but the omnipotence of God. That he's able to use somebody like Samson in a situation like this. Turn your attention to 2 Chronicles 33. 2 Chronicles 33 is a parallel account to the end of one of the chapters in 2 Kings. And whereas the passage in 2 Kings discusses a man named Manasseh who was so evil and so wicked that he was basically discarded, that's kind of the way the text treats him. 2 Chronicles chapter 3 discusses Manasseh in a slightly different light. In 2 Chronicles chapter 33, starting verse 9. Verse 9, we'll read this kind of a verse at a time. But in verse 9 gives you everything you need to know about this king. 2 Chronicles 33 and 9, it says, Manasseh misled Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the sons of Israel. How'd you like to have that on your tombstone? That you literally led your kingdom away from God farther than your enemies did. That's the situation that Manasseh's in, complete with idolatry, complete with immorality, complete with the complete abandonment of God. Verse 10, the Lord then spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they paid no attention. Manasseh is not listening to God in the slightest. Verse 11, therefore the Lord brought the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria against them. They captured Manasseh with hooks, which many people think is a hook through the nose like an ox would be, bound him with bronze chains, and took him to Babylon. Does that sound similar to who we were just talking about? But verse 12, when he was in distress, he entreated the Lord his God, and he humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. And when he prayed to him, he was moved by his entreaty and heard his supplication and brought him again to Jerusalem to his kingdom. And then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. Manasseh had no right at all. If you look at his life, and verse 9 is just kind of a little bit of a picture of it. Manasseh had no right to be named a child of God. Certainly shouldn't have existed in the annals of history in any term, any kind of glowing terms. And yet in 2 Chronicles chapter 33, at the very end of his life, when he's bound with hooks and he's taken to a far-off land, it's then that he cries out to God, which so many people do. At this point in their life, their times are hard, times of distress, they hit that panic button and they believe that God is going to be with them. And a lot of people do that, Manasseh included. But the difference is Manasseh in verses 11 and 12, when he was returned back to his kingdom, lived faithfully towards God. And the end of Manasseh's life is glowing. The end of Manasseh's life is righteous, it's holy, and what it tells you is that it doesn't matter what your previous life was like. It matters what you do towards God. It doesn't matter how evil you were. It doesn't matter how wicked you were. Anybody can turn towards God. If Manasseh can turn to God, anybody can. And it gives more light to 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 15, when Paul says, as Kyle mentioned in his invitation a few weeks ago, my favorite verse that he stole from me, he says, I am the chief of all sinners. And Paul doesn't say that to brag on himself. He says that to say, if I can be forgiven, then anybody can. But one of the most interesting pictures of Samson's life, this huge, mighty individual, is that he only talks to God on 2 different occasions. One of them is when he complains about being thirsty. That's the first time that Samson complains about, or talks to God, is when he complains about being thirsty. God opens up a rock, water comes out, and then he goes on his way. The only other time that he talks to him, the second time, is at the very end of his life. If you look at Judges chapter 16. Judges chapter 16, verse 20. We'll just read this one verse. Judges chapter 16, verse 20. This is when he's bound in the prison. This is when he puts his hands on the pillars. This is when he's in this moment of distress, moments before he dies. Judges chapter 16, verse 28. Samson calls to the Lord and says, O Lord God, please remember me. Please strengthen me just this one time, O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Samson doesn't talk to God, which is interesting considering he's a Nazarite from his mother's womb. He's supposed to do nothing except consecrate himself to God. But no recorded part of Samson's life, except for that one other occasion when he was thirsty, do we ever see Samson talking to God until now. And the greatest, most powerful figure, arguably, in all of Scripture, is brought to his knees in a Philistine prison as a sideshow for these people. And it's in that moment of distress that he utters the phrase, remember me, O God. You don't get much more humble than that. We see that same phrase, by the way, mentioned as Jesus is on the cross by the thief that's sitting next to him. And I think Luke's account is the only one that gives it. But this thief looks over at Jesus and he says very simply, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. It's a time of distress when you're in a Philistine prison or wherever you're nailed on a cross next to Jesus. When you're at your most desperate hour, for some reason in our lives, that's when we turn our hearts towards God. That's when we look more closely and more focused onto Him. Remember me at this moment. Now that's not to say that you can just say, remember me, O God, and your salvation is secure. That's not the point at all what I'm talking about. But what I am saying is that at your moment of trial, in your moment of distress, when your back's against the wall and everything is against you, do not be hesitant to cry out to God. But do not be equally hesitant, ladies and gentlemen, after you're restored, if you are restored, to live your life towards Him. We don't know what would have happened with Samson. We don't know what would have happened with the thief on the cross. We know that Manasseh in 2 Chronicles chapter 33 lived a life towards God. God is always there. He's always ready to forgive you. He's always willing to forgive you. Cry out to Him. Don't be ashamed. And don't be afraid to cry out to Him. My dad got on to me last week because I never answered the question for my sermon, which, granted, the question this week is Samson saved. I don't think anybody's going to answer that. It's kind of the point of it. But I don't know whether or not Samson will be saved. I'm not here to tell you that his soul is secure or that he's evil, and I'm not here to tell you that. But here's one thing I do know, based at least off of 2 Chronicles 33. We know that he could be saved. We know that anybody can be saved. It doesn't matter how evil you are in your life, and some people have this idea that no matter how bad they are, they can never be accepted by God. You can. But you have to turn back to Him. You have to bow your knees and bow yourself in front of God. Ask Him for His forgiveness. And live a life that is worthy of repentance, or live a life of repentance towards Him. One of the best examples of this, at least in recent history, is not Samson, and the mass murder of Jeffrey Dahmer. For the sake of people in this audience, especially your younger people, I won't go into the depths of his depravity, but those of you who are familiar with that name know exactly what Jeffrey Dahmer did. And Jeffrey Dahmer, in the late 80s, established a correspondence with a member of the church somewhere in Oklahoma, and he said that he didn't think anybody would come to him. He didn't think anybody would come to visit him in prison because of the nature of his crimes and his sins were so heinous that he didn't think anybody would. One person did. Out of all the letters and all the correspondence he had, one person, a member of the church in Oklahoma, visited him and baptized him. And he was killed in a prison riot, I think 6-8 months later. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if Samson can be saved, if Manasseh can be saved, if Jeffrey Dahmer can be saved, then you can be saved. Samson is a picture, and he's so much like us in so many ways, not because of our might, but because of the nature of our dependence on him. Just like Solomon, it doesn't matter how much money you have. Like Samson, it doesn't matter how strong you are, unless we live a life for God. All of that is useless. All those things fall by the wayside. Put those things, ladies and gentlemen, to the wayside this morning. Bow your knees towards God. Put him on through the waters of baptism, and he will receive you. Live a life that's obedient towards him. He will accept you. If you need the help of God, won't you come with me?